Welcome to listen to the audiobook, The Dead by James Joyce, prepared by the Virtual Books Editora team. Audiobook, The Dead by James Joyce. Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally devastated. She had scarcely led a gentleman into the little pantry behind the study on the ground floor and helped him out of his overcoat when the breathless bell on the hall door rang again and she had to hurry down the empty corridor to let in another guest. Good thing he didn't have to serve the ladies either, but Miss Kate and Miss. Julia thought about it and transformed the upstairs bathroom into a women's changing room. Miss Kate and Miss. Julia was there, gossiping and laughing and fussing, walking one after the other to the top of the stairs, peering over the banister and calling to Lily to ask who had come. It was always a grand event, the annual Miss Morkan ball. Everyone who knew them came, family members, old family friends, Julia's choir members, any of Kate's students who had grown up enough, and even some of Mary Jane's students. It never disappoints. For years and years, the ball had been held in splendid style, ever since Kate and Julia, after the death of their brother Pat, had left the house at Stony Batter and taken Mary Jane, their only niece, to live with them in the dark, dreary house on Usher's Island, the upper part of which they had rented from Mr. Fulham, the grain merchant, on the ground floor. That was a good 30 years ago, if you can say there ever was a day. Mary Jane, who was then a little girl in short clothes, was now the main support of the house, for she had the organ in Haddington Road. She had passed through the academy and gave a concert for the students every year in the upper hall of the old concert hall. Many of his students belonged to upper-class families of the Kingstown and Dalkey line. No matter how old they were, her aunts also did their part. Julia, though quite gray, was still the leading soprano at Adam and Eve's, and Kate, being too frail to move much, gave music lessons to beginners on the old square piano in the back parlor. Lily, the caretaker's daughter, worked as a maid for them. Although they lived modest lives, they believed in eating well. Best of all, diamond bone sirloin steaks, 3-shilling tea, and the finest bottled stout. But Lily rarely got her orders wrong, so she got along well with her three masters. They were just demanding, that's all. But the one thing they wouldn't tolerate was hasty answers. Of course, they had good reason to be excited on such a night, and it was well after 10 o'clock and there was still no sign of Gabriel and his wife. Besides, they were terribly afraid that Freddie Malins would turn up drunk. They would not for the life of them wish any of Mary Jane's pupils to see him under the influence of alcohol. And when he was like that, he was sometimes very difficult to deal with. Freddie Malins was always late, but they wondered what was keeping Gabriel, and it was this that brought them every 2 minutes to the banister to ask Lily if Gabriel or Freddie had come. "Oh, Mr. Conroy," Lily said to Gabriel as she opened the yacht door for him. "Miss Kate and Miss Julia thought you would never come. Good night, Mrs. Conroy." "I will get involved," said Gabriel, "but they forget that it takes my wife here 3 deadly hours to get dressed." He stood on the rug, scraping the snow from his galoshes while Lily led his wife to the foot of the stairs and shouted, "Miss Kate, here's Mrs. Conroy." Kate and Julia staggered down the dark stairs at the same time. They both kissed Gabriel's. Wife said she must have died alive and asked if Gabriel was with her. "Here I am, as sure as the post, Aunt Kate. Come up. I'll follow," Gabriel shouted from the darkness. He continued to scrape his feet vigorously as the 3 women went up, laughing, to the ladies' cloakroom. A light fringe of snow lay like a cape over the shoulders of his overcoat, and like toe caps on the toes of his galoshes, and as the buttons of his overcoat slid with a creak along the snow-stiffened lining, a cold, fragrant air from outside escaped through cracks and folds. "Is it snowing again, Mr. Conroy?" asked Lily. She had preceded him into the pantry to help him out of his overcoat. Gabriel smiled at the 3 syllables she had given to his surname and looked at her. She was a thin, growing girl with pale skin and hay-colored hair. The gas in the pantry made her look even paler. Gabriel had known her when she was a child and used to sit on the bottom step nursing a rag doll. "Yes, Lily," he replied, "and I suppose we shall have one of these evenings." He looked up at the pantry ceiling, which shook with the sound of footsteps on the floor above, listened to the piano for a moment, and then looked at the girl, who was folding her overcoat neatly on the edge of a shelf. "Tell me, Lily," he said in a friendly tone, "are you still at school?" "Oh no, sir," she replied. "I finished school this year and then some." "Ah, then," said Gabriel cheerfully. "I suppose we shall come to your wedding one of these wonderful days with your young man, eh?" The girl looked at him over her shoulder and said with great bitterness, "Men nowadays only know how to talk nonsense and try to get what they can out of you." Gabriel blushed as if he felt he had made a mistake, and without looking at her, he kicked off his galoshes and gave his patent leather shoes a brisk tap with his scarf. He was a tall, robust young man. The intense color of his cheeks rose to his forehead, where it spread in a few shapeless patches of pale red, and on his hairless face there gleamed restlessly the polished lenses and the shiny gold frames of the spectacles that shaded his delicate, restless eyes. His shiny black hair was parted in the middle and combed in a long curve behind his ears, where it curved slightly under the slit left by his hat. After polishing his shoes, he stood up and pulled his waistcoat tighter over his plump body. Then he quickly took a coin from his pocket. "Oh, Lily," he said, handing it to her. "It's Christmas time, isn't it? Just, here's a little." He walked quickly toward the door. "Oh, no, sir," cried the girl, following him. "Really, sir, I wouldn't have it." Christmas time, said Gabriel, almost running toward the stairs and waving his hand in disapproval. The girl, seeing that he had gone upstairs, called after him, "Well, thank you, sir." He waited outside the drawing-room door until the waltz was over, listening to the rustling of skirts against her and the shuffling of feet. He was still disturbed by the girl's sudden, bitter answer. She had left him with a melancholy which he tried to dispel by adjusting his cuffs and the bows of his tie. Then he took a little piece of paper from his waistcoat pocket and glanced at the headings he had written for his speech. He was undecided about Robert Browning's verses, for he feared they would be incomprehensible to his hearers. Some recognizable quotation from Shakespeare or the melodies would be better. The unkind click of the men's heels and the drag of their soles reminded him that their level of culture was different from his own. He would only make himself ridiculous by quoting poetry they could not understand. They would think he was boasting of his superior education. He would fail them, just as he had failed the girl in the scullery. He had adopted the wrong tone. His whole speech was a mistake, from beginning to end, a complete failure. At that moment his aunts and his wife came out of the ladies' cloakroom. His aunts were two small, plainly dressed ladies. Aunt Julia was about an inch taller. Her hair, pulled back over her ears, was gray. And gray too, with darker shades, was her large, sagging face. Though she was stout and stood erect, her slow eyes and parted lips gave her the appearance of a woman who did not know where she was or where she was going. Aunt Kate was more vivacious. Her face, healthier than her sister's, was all wrinkled, and wrinkled like a shriveled red apple, and her hair, braided in the same old way, had not lost the color of ripe walnuts. They both kissed Gabriel openly. He was her favorite nephew, the son of her late elder sister Ellen, who had married T.J. Conroy of the Porton Docks. "Gretta tells me you are not going to take a taxi back to Monkstown tonight, Gabriel," said Aunt Kate. "No," said Gabriel, turning to his wife. "We had enough of that last year, didn't we? Don't you remember, Aunt Kate, the cold Gretta caught? The windows of the taxi rattled all the time, and the east wind blew after we got past Marion. It was very good. Gretta caught a terrible cold." Aunt Kate frowned severely and shook her head at every word. "You're right, Gabriel. You're right," she said. "You can't be too careful." "But as for Gretta," said Gabriel, "she'd walk home in the snow if they let her." Mrs. Conroy laughed. "Don't mind him, Aunt Kate," she said. "He's a real bore, with green sunglasses over Tom's eyes at night and making him do exercises with dumbbells and making Eva eat the stirabout. Poor child. And she just hates the sight of it. Oh, but you'll never guess what he makes me wear now." She burst out laughing and looked at her husband, whose admiring and happy eyes roamed over her dress, her face, and her hair. The two aunts laughed heartily too, for Gabriel's solicitude was a constant source of amusement to them. "Galoshes," said Mrs. Conroy. "That's the latest thing. Whenever it's wet, I have to put on my galoshes. Tonight even he wanted me to, but I wouldn't. The next thing he'll buy me is a wetsuit." Gabriel laughed nervously and patted his tie reassuringly, while Aunt Kate almost doubled over. So excitedly did she enjoy the joke. The smile soon disappeared from Aunt Julia's face, and her mirthless eyes returned to her nephew's face. After a pause, she asked, "And what are galoshes, Gabriel?" "Galoshes, Julia," cried her sister. "My goodness, don't you know what galoshes are? You wear them over your boots, Gretta, don't you?" "Yes," said Mrs. Conroy. "Gutta percha things. We've both got a pair now. Gabriel says everybody wears them on the continent." "Oh, on the continent," murmured Aunt Julia, shaking her head slowly. Gabriel frowned and said, as if a little irritated, "It's nothing very wonderful, but Gretta thinks it's very funny because she says the word reminds her of Christie, minstrels." "But tell me, Gabriel," said Aunt Kate with quick tact. "Of course you saw what happened in the room. Gretta was saying—" "Oh, the room's very nice," answered Gabriel. "I've had one at the Gresham." "Certainly," said Aunt Kate, "by far the best thing to do. And the children, Gretta, aren't you worried about them?" "Oh, for one night," said Mrs. Conroy. "Besides, Bessie will look after them." "Certainly," said Aunt Kate again. "What a comfort it is to have a girl like that, one you can trust. There's that Lily, I'm sure I don't know what's gotten into her lately. She's not the same girl she used to be." Gabriel was about to ask his aunt some questions on this subject, but she stopped suddenly to look at her sister, who had come downstairs and was craning her neck over the banister. "Now I ask," she said almost irritably, "where is Julia going? Julia, Julia, where are you going?" Julia, who had already descended half a flight of stairs, came back and announced softly, "Here's Freddie." At the same moment, a clap of hands and a last flourish from the pianist announced the end of the waltz. The drawing-room door was opened from within, and a few couples came out. Aunt Kate hurriedly pulled Gabriel aside and whispered in his ear, "Come down, Gabriel, like a good fellow, and see that he's all right, and don't let him get up if he's screwed. I'm sure he is screwed. I'm sure he is." Gabriel went to the stairs and listened over the banister. He heard two people talking in the pantry. Then he recognized Freddie Malins' laugh. He came clattering down the stairs. "It's a relief," said Aunt Kate to Mrs. Conroy, "that Gabriel's here. I always feel so much more at ease when he's here. Julia, there's Miss Daly and Miss Power going to have a drink. Thank you for your lovely waltz, Miss Daly. It was a wonderful time." A tall, lined-faced man with a stiff gray mustache and olive skin, who was swooning over his partner, said, "And can we have some refreshments too, Miss Morkan?" "Julia," said Aunt Kate curtly, "and here are Mr. Brown and Miss Furlong. Show them in, Julia, with Miss Daly and Miss Power." "I am just the ladies' man," said Mr. Brown, pursing his lips until his mustache bristled, and smiling through all the wrinkles. "Do you know, Miss Morkan, the reason they like me so much is—" He did not finish the sentence, but seeing that Aunt Kate was out of earshot, he at once led the three young ladies into the back room. The center of the room was occupied by two square tables side by side, and on them Aunt Julia and the caretaker were straightening and smoothing a large cloth. On the sideboard were laid out plates and dishes, glasses and stacks of knives, forks and spoons. The top of the closed square piano also served as a sideboard for dainties and sweetmeats. On a smaller sideboard in the corner, two young men were standing, drinking hop bitters. Mr. Brown led his charges over and jokingly invited them all to a hot, strong, sweet lady punch. As they said they never drank anything strong, he opened 3 bottles of lemonade for them. Then he asked one of the young men to step aside and, taking the bottle, poured himself a goodly glass of whiskey. The young men looked at him respectfully as he took a tasting sip. "God help me," he said, smiling. "It's the doctor's orders." His wrinkled face broke into a wider smile, and the 3 young women laughed in musical echo of his joke, rocking their bodies back and forth with nervous movements of the shoulders. The boldest said, "Oh, Mr. Brown, I'm sure the doctor never ordered anything like that." Mr. Brown took another sip of whiskey and said in a furtive imitation, "Well, you see, I am like the famous Mrs. Cassidy, who is said to have said, 'Now, Mary Grimes, if I don't take it, make me take it, for I feel I want it.'" His warm face had leaned forward a little too confidentially, and he had put on a very low Dublin accent, so that the young ladies instinctively listened to his speech in silence. Miss Furlong, Mary Jane's pupil, asked Miss Daly the name of the beautiful waltz she had played, and Mr. Brown, finding himself ignored, turned promptly to the two young men who were most appreciative. A red-faced young lady, dressed as a pansy, came into the room clapping her hands excitedly and shouting, "Quadrilles! Quadrilles!" Close behind her came Aunt Kate, crying, "Two gentlemen and three ladies, Mary Jane." "Ah, here are Mr. Bergen and Mr. Carrigan," said Mary Jane. "Mr. Carrigan, will you take Miss Power? Miss Furlong, can I get you a date, Mr. Bergen? Oh, that's all right for now." "Three ladies, Mary Jane," said Aunt Kate. The two young gentlemen asked the ladies if they would have the pleasure, and Mary Jane turned to Miss Daly. "Oh, Miss Daly, you are very good indeed after playing the last two dances, but we are short of girls tonight. I don't mind at all, Miss Morkan, but I have a very good partner for you, Mr. Bartell Darcy, the tenor. I shall get him to sing later. All Dublin is raving about him." "What a beautiful voice, what a beautiful voice," said Aunt Kate. When the piano had twice begun the prelude to the first figure, Mary Jane led her recruits quickly out of the room. They had scarcely left when Aunt Julia came slowly into the room, looking behind her. "What is the matter, Julia?" asked Aunt Kate anxiously. "Who is it?" Julia, who was carrying a column of napkins, turned to her sister and said simply, as if the question had surprised her, "There are only Freddie, Kate, and Gabriel with him." Indeed, just behind her, Gabriel could be seen piloting Freddie Malins across the landing. The latter, a young man of about 40, was about the same size and build as Gabriel, with very stooping shoulders. His face was fleshy and pale, with only a few touches of color in the thick, pendulous lobes of his ears and the broad wings of his nose. He had coarse features, a flat nose, a convex, receding forehead, and swollen, protruding lips. His heavy-lidded eyes and the disorder of his thin hair made him look sleepy. He was laughing heartily, in a high-pitched tone, at a story he had told Gabriel on the stairs, and at the same time he was rubbing the knuckles of his left wrist back and forth over his left eye. "Good night, Freddie," said Aunt Julia. Freddie Malins bade the Misses Morkan good night in a manner that seemed casual, for his voice was breaking, and then, seeing that Mr. Brown was smiling at him from the sideboard, he crossed the room on shaky legs and began to repeat in a low voice the story he had just told Gabriel. "He's not so bad, is he?" said Aunt Kate to Gabriel. Gabriel's eyebrows were dark, but he raised them quickly and said, "Oh no, you hardly notice it." "Why, isn't he a horrible fellow?" she said, "and his poor mother made him take the oath on New Year's Eve. But come, Gabriel, into the drawing room." Before leaving the room with Gabriel, she signaled to Mr. Brown with a frown and a wagging of her forefinger in warning. Mr. Brown nodded in reply, and as she left, he said to Freddie Malins, "Now, Teddy, I'll fix you a nice glass of lemonade, just to cheer you up." Freddie Malins, who was approaching the climax of his story, impatiently declined the offer, but Mr. Brown, having first drawn Freddie Malin's attention to a disarray in his clothes, filled it and handed him a full glass of lemonade. Freddie Malin's left hand accepted the glass mechanically, while his right hand was occupied in the mechanical readjustment of his clothes. Mr. Brown, whose face was wrinkling with joy once more, poured himself a glass of whiskey while Freddie Malins burst, even before he had reached the climax of his story, into a fit of acute bronchitis-like laughter, and, putting down the tasteless and overflowing glass, began rubbing the knuckles of his left fist back and forth across his left eye, repeating the words of his last sentence as well as his fit of laughter would allow. Gabriel could not hear Mary Jane playing her Academy piece, full of difficult passages and passages, to the silent drawing room. He liked music, but the piece she was playing had no melody for him, and he doubted if it had any for the other listeners, though Mary Jane had been begged to play something. 4 young people, who had come from the dining room to stand in the doorway listening to the piano, had gone away silently in pairs after a few minutes. The only people who seemed to be following the music were Mary Jane herself, with her hands running over the keyboard or rising from it at pauses like those of a priestess in momentary imprecation, and Aunt Kate, standing by her to turn the page. Gabriel's, eyes irritated by the floor which shone with beeswax under the heavy chandelier, wandered to the wall above the piano, A picture of the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet hung there, and beside it a picture of the two murdered princes in the tower, which Aunt Julia had worked in red, blue, and brown wool when she was a girl. Probably at the school they had attended. As girls, they had been taught this kind of work for a year. For her birthday, her mother had given her a purple tablecloth with little fox heads, lined with brown satin, and with round mulberry buttons. It was odd that her mother had no musical talent, though Aunt Kate had called her the brains of the Morkan family. Both she and Julia had always seemed a little proud of their serious matronly sister. Her photograph stood before the mirror. She held an open book on her knees and pointed something in it to Constantine, who, dressed in a caravel suit, lay at her feet. It was she who had chosen the names of her children, for she was very conscious of the dignity of family life. Thanks to her, Constantine was now senior curate at Balbriggan, and thanks to her, Gabriel himself had graduated from the Royal College. A shadow passed over his face as he remembered her sullen opposition to his marriage. Some of the disparaging phrases she had used still bothered him. She had once spoken of Gretta as a nice country woman, and that did not apply to Gretta. It was Gretta who had nursed her through her long and final illness at their house in Monkstown. He knew that Mary Jane must be nearing the end of the piece, for she was playing the opening melody again, with scale sequences after each bar, and, as he waited for the end, the resentment in his heart subsided. The piece ended with a trill of octaves in the high and a final deep octave in the low. Great applause greeted Mary Jane as, blushing and nervously rolling her sheet music, she slipped from the room. The most vigorous applause came from the 4 young men at the door, who had gone into the dining room at the beginning of the piece, but returned when the piano stopped. Lancers were arranged. Gabriel found himself paired with Miss Ivers. She was a frank, talkative young woman with a freckled face and prominent brown eyes. She wore no low-cut bodice, and the large brooch pinned to the front of her collar bore an Irish motto and coat of arms. As they took their places, she said abruptly, "I have a raven to pluck with you." "With me?" said Gabriel. She nodded gravely. "What is it?" asked Gabriel, smiling at his solemn manner. "Who is G.C.?" replied Miss Ivers, turning her eyes upon him. Gabriel blushed, and was about to frown as if he did not understand, when she said bluntly, "Oh, innocent Amy, I find that you write for the Daily Express, and aren't you ashamed of yourself?" "Why should I be ashamed of myself?" asked Gabriel, blinking his eyes and trying to smile. "Well, I am ashamed of you," said Miss Ivers frankly, "to say that you would write for such a paper as that. I didn't suppose you were a West Briton." A look of puzzlement came over Gabriel's face. It was true that he wrote a literary column every Wednesday in the Daily Express, for which he received 15 shillings, but that certainly did not make him a West Briton. The books he received for review were almost more welcome than the paltry cheque. He loved to feel the covers and turn the pages of the newly printed books. Almost every day when he had finished teaching at the college, he would wander along the quayside to the second-hand bookshops, to Hickey's in Bachelor's Walk, to Webb's or Massey's in Aston's Quay, or to O'Clohissy's in the side street. He did not know how to deal with her pressure. He wanted to say that literature was above politics. But they had been friends for a long time, and their careers had run parallel, first at university and then as teachers. He could not risk a grandiose sentence with her. He kept blinking, trying to smile, and muttered half-heartedly that he saw nothing political about writing book reviews. When it came to their turn to cross, he was still puzzled and inattentive. Miss Ivers readily took his hand in a warm grip and said in a soft, friendly tone, "Of course, I was only joking. Come, let's cross now." When they met again, she spoke of the university question, and Gabriel felt more at ease. A friend of hers had shown her his review of Browning's poems. That was how she had discovered the secret, but she liked it immensely. Then suddenly she said, "Oh, Mr. Conroy, would you come for a trip to the Aran Islands this summer? We are going to be there for a whole month. It will be splendid in the Atlantic. You should come. Mr. Clancy is coming, and so are Mr. Kilkelly and Kathleen Kearney. It would be splendid for Gretta, too, if she came. She is from Connaught, isn't she? Her people are. said Gabriel shortly. "But you will come, won't you?" said Miss Ivers, laying her warm hand eagerly on his arm. "The fact is," said Gabriel, "I have just arranged to go." "Go where?" asked Miss Ivers. "Well, you know, every year I go on a bicycle ride with some of my friends and then—" "But where?" asked Miss Ivers. "Well, we usually go to France, Belgium, or perhaps Germany," said Gabriel awkwardly. "And why do you go to France and Belgium?" said Miss Ivers, "instead of visiting your own country?" "Well," said Gabriel, "it's partly to keep in touch with the languages and partly for a change. And haven't you got your own language to keep in touch with?" "Irish?" asked Miss Ivers. "Well," said Gabriel, "if it comes to that, you know, Irish isn't my language." The neighbors turned to listen to the questioning. Gabriel looked nervously to the right and left and tried to keep his good humor in the face of a situation that made him blush. "And haven't you got your own country to visit?" continued Miss Ivers, "of which you know nothing. Your own people and your own country?" "Oh, to tell you the truth," said Gabriel suddenly, "I'm sick of my own country, sick of it." "Why?" asked Miss Ivers. Gabriel made no reply, for her answer had excited him. "Why?" repeated Miss Ivers. They had to go and see each other together, and when he did not answer her, Miss Ivers said warmly, "Of course you have no answer." Gabriel tried to disguise his agitation by joining in the dance with great energy. He avoided her gaze, for he had seen a sour expression on her face, but when they met in the long chain, he was surprised to feel her hand pressed firmly upon his. She stared at him from under her brows for a moment, puzzled, until he smiled. Then, as the chain was about to start again, she stood on tiptoe and whispered in his ear, "Western British." When the Lancers were finished, Gabriel went to a remote corner of the room where Freddie Malan's mother was sitting. She was a stout, frail old woman with white hair. Her voice had a choked tone like her son's, and she stuttered a little. They told him that Freddie had come and was almost okay. Gabriel asked if she had a good crossing. She lived with her married daughter in Glasgow and came to Dublin for a visit once a year. She replied placidly that she had had a beautiful crossing and that the captain had been very attentive to her. He also spoke of the beautiful home his daughter kept in Glasgow and of all the friends they had there. As his tongue wandered, Gabriel tried to banish from his mind all memory of the unpleasant incident with Miss Ivers. Of course the girl, or woman, or whatever she was an enthusiast, but there was a time for everything. Maybe he shouldn't have responded that way, but she had no right to call him a West Briton in front of people, even jokingly. She tried to make him look ridiculous in front of people by booing him and looking at him with her rabbit eyes. He saw his wife coming towards him through the couples dancing the waltz. On reaching him, she said in his ear, "Gabriel, Aunt Kate wants to know if you won't carve the goose as usual. Miss Daly will carve the ham, and I will make the pudding." "Okay," Gabriel said. "She'll have the youngest ones come in first, as soon as the waltz is over, so that it's just us at the table." "Were you dancing?" asked Gabriel. "Of course I do. Didn't you see me? What fight did you have with Molly Ivers?" "No discussion." "Why? Did she say that?" "Something like that. I'm trying to make that Mr. Darcy sing. He's full of conceit, I think." "There was no discussion," Gabriel said sullenly. "Just that she wanted me to go on a trip to the west of Ireland, and I said I wouldn't do it." His wife clasped her hands together excitedly and gave a little jump. "Oh, come on, Gabriel," she cried. "I would love to see Galway again." "You can go if you want," Gabriel said coldly. She looked at him for a moment, then turned to Mrs. Malins and said, "Here is a handsome husband for you, Mrs. Malins." As she walked back through the room, Mrs. Malins, not noticing the interruption, continued telling Gabriel about the beautiful places in Scotland and the beautiful landscapes. His son-in-law took them to the lakes every year, and they used to fish. His son-in-law was a splendid fisherman. One day he caught a nice big fish, and the man at the hotel cooked it for their dinner. Gabriel barely heard what she said. Now that dinner was approaching, he began to think again about his speech and the quote. When he saw Freddie Malins crossing the room to visit his mother, Gabriel vacated the chair for him and retreated to the window. The room was already empty, and from the back room came the noise of plates and knives. Those who still remained in The living room seemed tired from dancing and were chatting quietly in small groups. Gabriel's warm, trembling fingers tapped on the cold window pane. How cold it must have been outside. How cool it would be to walk alone, first along the river and then through the park. Snow would be falling on the tree branches and forming a shiny layer on top of the Wellington Monument. How much nicer it would be there than at the dinner table. He ran through the titles of his speech: Irish Hospitality, Sad Memories, The Three Graces, Paris, the Browning quote. He repeated to himself a sentence he had written in his review: "You feel as if you are listening to music tormented by thought." Miss Ivors praised the review. Would she be sincere? Do you really have a life of your own behind all your propaganda? Both she and Julia had always seemed a little proud of their serious matronly sister. Her photograph stood before the mirror. She held an open book on her knees and pointed something in it to Constantine, who, dressed in a caravel suit, lay at her feet. It was she who had chosen the names of her children, for she was very conscious of the dignity of family life. Thanks to her, Constantine was now senior curate at Balbriggan, and thanks to her, Gabriel himself had graduated from the Royal College. A shadow passed over his face as he remembered her sullen opposition to his marriage. Some of the disparaging phrases she had used still bothered him. She had once spoken of Gretta as a nice country woman, and that did not apply to Gretta. It was Gretta who had nursed her through her long and final illness at their house in Monkstown. He knew that Mary Jane must be nearing the end of the piece, for she was playing the opening melody again, with scale sequences after each bar, and, as he waited for the end, the resentment in his heart subsided. The piece ended with a trill of octaves in the high and a final deep octave in the low. Great applause greeted Mary Jane as, blushing and nervously rolling her sheet music, she slipped from the room. The most vigorous applause came from the 4 young men at the door, who had gone into the dining room at the beginning of the piece, but returned when the piano stopped. Lancers were arranged. Gabriel found himself paired with Miss Ivors. She was a frank, talkative young woman with a freckled face and prominent brown eyes. She wore no low-cut bodice, and the large brooch pinned to the front of her collar bore an Irish motto and coat of arms. As they took their places, she said abruptly, "I have a raven to pluck with you." "With me?" said Gabriel. She nodded gravely. "What is it?" asked Gabriel, smiling at his solemn manner. "Who is G.C.?" replied Miss Ivors, turning her eyes upon him. Gabriel blushed, and was about to frown as if he did not understand, when she said bluntly, "Oh, innocent Amy, I find that you write for the Daily Express, and aren't you ashamed of yourself?" "Why should I be ashamed of myself?" asked Gabriel, blinking his eyes and trying to smile. "Well, I am ashamed of you," said Miss Ivors frankly, "to say that you would write for such a paper as that. I didn't suppose you were a West Briton." A look of puzzlement came over Gabriel's face. It was true that he wrote a literary column every Wednesday in the Daily Express, for which he received 15 shillings, but that certainly did not make him a West Briton. The books he received for review were almost more welcome than the paltry check. He loved to feel the covers and turn the pages of the newly printed books. Almost every day when he had finished teaching at the college, he would wander along the quayside to the second-hand bookshops, to Hickey's in Bachelor's Walk, to Webb's or Massey's in Aston's Quay, or to O'Clohissy's in the side street. He did not know how to deal with her pressure. He wanted to say that literature was above politics. But they had been friends for a long time, and their careers had run parallel, first at university and then as teachers. He could not risk a grandiose sentence with her. He kept blinking, trying to smile, and muttered half-heartedly that he saw nothing political about writing book reviews. When it came to their turn to cross, he was still puzzled and inattentive. Miss Ivors readily took his hand in a warm grip and said in a soft, friendly tone, "Of course, I was only joking. Come, let's cross now." When they met again, she spoke of the university question, and Gabriel felt more at ease. A friend of hers had shown her his review of Browning's poems. That was how she had discovered the secret, but she liked it immensely. Then suddenly she said, "Oh, Mr. Conroy, would you come for a trip to the Aran Islands this summer?" We are going to be there for a whole month. It will be splendid in the Atlantic. You should come. Mr. Clancy is coming, and so are Mr. Kilkelly and Kathleen Kearney. It would be splendid for Gretta, too, if she came. She is from Connaught, isn't she? Her people are, said Gabriel shortly. But you will come, won't you? Said Miss Ivers, laying her warm hand eagerly on his arm. The fact is, said Gabriel, I have just arranged to go. Go where? Asked Miss Ivers. Well, you know, every year I go on a bicycle ride with some of my friends and then... But where? Asked Miss Ivers. Well, we usually go to France, Belgium, or perhaps Germany, said Gabriel awkwardly. And why do you go to France and Belgium? Said Miss Ivers, instead of visiting your own country? Well, said Gabriel, it's partly to keep in touch with the languages and partly for a change. And haven't you got your own language to keep in touch with? Irish? Asked Miss Ivers. Well, said Gabriel, if it comes to that, you know, Irish isn't my language. The neighbors turned to listen to the questioning. Gabriel looked nervously to the right and left and tried to keep his good humor in the face of a situation that made him blush. And haven't you got your own country to visit? Continued Miss Ivers, of which you know nothing. Your own people and your own country? Oh, to tell you the truth, said Gabriel suddenly, I'm sick of my own country, sick of it. Why? Asked Miss Ivers. Gabriel made no reply, for her answer had excited him. Why? Repeated Miss Ivers. They had to go and see each other together, and when he did not answer her, Miss Ivers said warmly, Of course you have no answer. Gabriel tried to disguise his agitation by joining in the dance with great energy. He avoided her gaze, for he had seen a sour expression on her face, but when they met in the long chain, he was surprised to feel her hand pressed firmly upon his. She stared at him from under her brows for a moment, puzzled, until he smiled. Then, as the chain was about to start again, she stood on tiptoe and whispered in his ear, Western British. When the Lancers were finished, Gabriel went to a remote corner of the room where Freddie Malin's mother was sitting. She was a stout, frail old woman with white hair. Her voice had a choked tone like her son's, and she stuttered a little. They told him that Freddie had come and was almost okay. Gabriel asked if she had a good crossing. She lived with her married daughter in Glasgow and came to Dublin for a visit once a year. She replied placidly that she had had a beautiful crossing and that the captain had been very attentive to her. He also spoke of the beautiful home his daughter kept in Glasgow and of all the friends they had there. As his tongue wandered, Gabriel tried to banish from his mind all memory of the unpleasant incident with Miss Ivers. Of course the girl, or woman, or whatever she was an enthusiast, but there was a time for everything. Maybe he shouldn't have responded that way, but she had no right to call him a West Briton in front of people, even jokingly. She tried to make him look ridiculous in front of people by booing him and looking at him with her rabbit eyes. He saw his wife coming towards him through the couples dancing the waltz. On reaching him, she said in his ear, Gabriel, Aunt Kate wants to know if you won't carve the goose as usual. Miss Daly will carve the ham, and I will make the pudding. Okay, Gabriel said. She'll have the youngest ones come in first, as soon as the waltz is over, so that it's just us at the table. Were you dancing? Asked Gabriel. Of course I do. Didn't you see me? What fight did you have with Molly Ivers? No discussion. Why? Did she say that? Something like that. I'm trying to make that Mr. Darcy sing. He's full of conceit, I think. There was no discussion, Gabriel said sullenly. Just that she wanted me to go on a trip to the west of Ireland, and I said I wouldn't do it. His wife clasped her hands together excitedly and gave a little jump. Oh, come on, Gabriel, she cried. I would love to see Galway again. You can go if you want, Gabriel said coldly. She looked at him for a moment, then turned to Mrs. Malins and said, Here is a handsome husband for you, Mrs. Malins. As she walked back through the room, Mrs. Malins, not noticing the interruption, continued telling Gabriel about the beautiful places in Scotland and the beautiful landscapes. His son-in-law took them to the lakes every year, and they used to fish. His son-in-law was a splendid fisherman. One day he caught a nice big fish, and the man at the hotel cooked it for their dinner. Gabriel barely heard what she said. Now that dinner was approaching, he began to think again about his speech. And the quote. When he saw Freddie Malins crossing the room to visit his mother, Gabriel vacated the chair for him and retreated to the window. The room was already empty, and from the back room came the noise of plates and knives. Those who still remained in the living room seemed tired from dancing and were chatting quietly in small groups. Gabriel's warm, trembling fingers tapped on the cold window pane. How cold it must have been outside. How cool it would be to walk alone, first along the river and then through the park. Snow would be falling on the tree branches and forming a shiny layer on top of the Wellington Monument. How much nicer it would be there than at the dinner table. He ran through the titles of his speech: Irish Hospitality, Sad Memories, The Three Graces, Paris, the Browning quote. He repeated to himself a sentence he had written in his review: You feel as if you are listening to music tormented by thought. Miss Ivors praised the review. Would she be sincere? Do you really have a life of your own behind all your propaganda? Mr. Brown begged them to sit down and dine, and Gabriel too, but they said there was still time enough for Freddie Malins to finally rise and, seizing Aunt Kate, throw her into the chair amidst general laughter. When everyone had been well served, Gabriel said with a smile, Now if anyone wants a little more of what common people call stuffing, let him speak. A chorus of voices invited him to start his own dinner, and Lily approached with 3 potatoes she had set aside for him. Very well, Gabriel said amiably as he took another preparatory sip. Please forget my existence, ladies and gentlemen, for a few minutes. He set to dinner and did not join in the conversation with which the table covered Lily's removal of the dishes. The subject of conversation was the opera company, then performing at the Theatre Royal. Mr. Bartell D'Arcy, the tenor, a dark young man with a dapper mustache, was full of praise for the company's leading contralto, but Miss Furlong thought her production style was somewhat vulgar. Freddie Malin said there was a black chief singing in the second part of the Gaiety pantomime, who had one of the finest tenor voices he had ever heard. Did you hear him? He asked Mr. Bartell D'Arcy across the table. No, replied Mr. Bartell D'Arcy carelessly. Because, explained Freddie Malins, I should be curious to know your opinion of him now. I think he has a wonderful voice. It takes Teddy to find out the really good stuff, said Mr. Brown familiarly at the table. And why shouldn't he have a voice too? Asked Freddie Malins sharply. Is it just because he's black? No one answered the question, and Mary Jane led the table back to the real opera. One of her students had given her a pass for Mignon. Of course it was very good, she said, but it made her think of poor Georgina Burns. Mr. Brown could go back even further, to the old Italian companies that used to come to Dublin: Tietjens, Ilma de Murzka, Campanini, the great Trebelli, Giuglini, Ravelli, Aramburo. Those were the days, he said, when you heard anything like singing in Dublin. He told how the upper gallery of the Old Royal used to be packed night after night, how one night an Italian tenor sang 5 encores of Let Me Like a Soldier Fall, introducing a high C each time, and how the boys in the gallery would sometimes, in their enthusiasm, unhitch the horses from some great prima donna's carriage and pull her themselves through the streets to the hotel. Why did they never play the great old operas anymore, he asked. Dinorah, Lucrezia Borgia? Because they couldn't make the voices sing, that was why. Oh well, said Mr. Bartell D'Arcy. I suppose there are as good singers now as there were then. Where are they? Asked Mr. Brown defiantly. In London, Paris, Milan, said Mr. Bartell D'Arcy warmly. I suppose Caruso, for instance, is as good, if not better, than any of the men you mentioned. Perhaps, said Mr. Brown. But I can tell. You, I doubt it very much. Oh, I would give anything to hear Caruso sing, said Mary Jane. To me, said Aunt Kate, who was picking at a bone, there was only one tenor. To please me, I mean. But I suppose none of you ever heard of him. Who was he, Miss Morkan? Asked Mr. Bartell D'Arcy politely. His name, said Aunt Kate, was Parkinson. I heard him when he was in his prime, and I think he had the purest tenor voice that ever was put into a man's throat. Strange, said Mr. Bartell D'Arcy. I never heard of him. Yes, Miss Morkan is right, said Mr. Brown. I remember hearing of old Parkinson, but he is too old for me. A beautiful, pure, sweet, mellow English tenor, said Aunt Kate enthusiastically. Gabriel, having finished the enormous pudding, was transferred to the table. The clatter of forks and spoons began again. Gabriel's wife spooned out the pudding and passed the plates around the table. Halfway through, they were held back by Mary Jane, who replenished them with raspberry, or orange marmalade, or with blancmange and jelly. The pudding was made by Aunt Julia, and she received compliments from all sides. She herself said it was not brown enough. "Well, I hope, Miss Morkan," said Mr. Brown, "that I am dark enough for you, for, you know, I am all dark." All the gentlemen except Gabriel ate some of the pudding in compliment to Aunt Julia. As Gabriel never ate sweets, the celery had been left for him. Freddie Malins also picked up a stick of celery and ate it with the pudding. He was told that celery was good for the blood, and that he was under medical care. Mrs. Malins, who had been silent all through dinner, said that her son was going to Mount Melleray in about a week. The table then talked about Mount Melleray, how refreshing the air was there, how hospitable the monks were, and how they never asked a penny of their guests. "And you mean to say," asked Mr. Brown incredulously, "that a fellow can go there and stay there as if it were a hotel, live as well as he can, and then come back without paying anything? Most people make some donation to the monastery when they go away," said Mary Jane. "I wish we had an institution like that in our church," said Mr. Brown frankly. He was surprised to learn that the monks never spoke, got up at 2 in the morning and slept in their coffins. He asked why they did that. "That's the rule of the order," said Aunt Kate firmly. "Yes, but why?" asked Mr. Brown. Aunt Kate repeated that it was the rule, that was all. Mr. Brown still did not seem to understand. Freddie Malins explained, to him as best he could, that the monks were trying to make up for the sins committed by all the sinners in the outside world. The explanation was not very clear, for Mr. Brown smiled and said, "I like that idea very much, but wouldn't a comfortable spring bed be as good as a coffin?" "The coffin," said Mary Jane, "is to remind them of their ultimate end." As the subject became so somber, it was buried in the silence of the table, during which Mrs. Malins could be heard saying to her neighbor in an indistinct tone, "They are very good men, the monks, very pious men." The raisins, almonds, figs, apples, oranges, chocolates, and sweetmeats were then distributed around the table, and Aunt Julia invited all the guests to take port or sherry. At first, Mr. Bartle Darcy refused to take either, but one of his neighbors nudged him and whispered something, and he allowed his glass to be filled. Gradually, as the last glasses were filled, the conversation ceased. A pause followed, broken only by the rattle of wine and the movement of chairs. The Misses Morkan, all three, looked at the tablecloth. Someone coughed once or twice, and then a few gentlemen patted the table in token of silence. Silence fell, and Gabriel pushed back his chair. The patting immediately increased in encouragement, and then ceased altogether. Gabriel rested his 10 trembling fingers on the tablecloth and smiled nervously at the company. Finding a row of upturned faces, he looked up at the chandelier. The piano was playing a waltz, and he could hear skirts flapping against the drawing-room door. People, perhaps, were standing in the snow on the quay outside, looking up at the lighted windows and listening to the waltz music. The air was pure there. In the distance stretched the park where the trees were heavy with snow. The Wellington Monument was wearing a brilliant coat of snow that shone westwards over the white 15 acres field. He began, "Ladies and gentlemen, it has fallen to me this evening, as in former years, to perform a very pleasant task, but one for which I fear my feeble powers of oratory are inadequate." "No, no," said Mr. Brown. "But be that as it may, I can only ask you this evening to make the will, and to lend me your attention for a few moments while I endeavor to express in words what my feelings are on this occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the first time we have gathered under this hospitable roof, around this hospitable council. It is not the first time we have been the beneficiaries, or perhaps, better said, victims, of the hospitality of certain good ladies." He made a circle in the air with his arm and stopped. Everyone laughed or smiled at Aunt Kate, Aunt Julia, and Mary Jane, who blushed with pleasure. Gabriel continued more boldly, "I feel more strongly every year that our country has no tradition which does it so much honor, and which it should cherish so zealously, as that of hospitality. It is a tradition which, in my experience, and I have visited many places abroad, is unique among modern nations. Some would say perhaps that it is more a failing than something to be boasted of in our country. But admitting this, it is, in my opinion, a princely failing, and one which I trust will long be cherished among us. Of one thing, at least, I am certain. So long as this single roof shelters the good ladies mentioned, and I hope with all my heart that it may be so for many, many years to come, the tradition of genuine and warm Irish hospitality, which our ancestors have bequeathed to us, and which we in turn must pass on to our descendants, is still alive among us. A warm murmur of agreement ran round the table. Gabriel perceived that Miss Ivors was not there, and had rudely departed, and he said confidently, "Ladies and gentlemen, a new generation is growing up in our midst, a generation moved by new ideas and new principles. It is earnest and enthusiastic about these new ideas, and its enthusiasm, even when misdirected, is, I believe, largely sincere. But we live in a skeptical, and if I may say so, a thought-tormented age, and I sometimes fear that this new generation, educated or overeducated as it is, lacks those qualities of humanity, of hospitality, of gentle humor, which belong to an earlier age." Hearing this evening the names of all those great singers of the past, it seemed to me, I must confess, that we were living in a less spacious age. Those days might, without exaggeration, be called spacious days. And if they are gone forever, let us hope at least that at gatherings like this we shall still speak of them with pride and affection, and still cherish in our hearts the memory of those great dead and departed whose fame the world will not willingly let die. "Here, here," said Mr. Brown aloud. "But nevertheless," continued Gabriel, his voice assuming a softer tone, "there are always at gatherings like this sadder thoughts that come into our minds, thoughts of the past, of youth, of changes, of absent faces which we miss tonight. Our path through life is strewn with many such sad recollections, and if we were to brood over them forever, we should not have the courage to pursue our work bravely among the living. We all have living duties and affections, which rightly demand our arduous exertions, so I will not dwell on the past. I will not allow any dark morals to intrude upon us this evening. Here we are gathered for a brief moment, away from the hustle and bustle of our daily routine. We are welcomed, here as friends in a spirit of fellowship, as colleagues also to a certain extent in the true spirit of fellowship, and as guests of, what shall I call them, the three graces of the Dublin musical world. The table burst into applause and laughter at the allusion. Aunt Julia, in vain, asked each of the neighbors to tell her what Gabriel had said. "He says we are the three graces, Aunt Julia," said Mary Jane. Aunt Julia did not understand, but she looked at Gabriel smiling, who continued in the same tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I shall not attempt to play this evening the part that Paris played on another occasion. I shall not attempt to choose between them. The task would be unbearable and beyond my meager strength. For when I look at them, one by one, whether it be our principal hostess, whose good heart, whose very good heart, has become a symbol to all who know her, or her sister, who seems endowed with perennial youth and whose singing must have been a surprise and a revelation to us all this evening, or, last but not least, when I think of our youngest hostess, talented, cheerful, hard-working, and the best of nieces, I confess, ladies and gentlemen, that I do not know to which of them to award the prize." Gabriel looked at the aunts and, seeing the broad smile on Aunt Julia's face and the tears that welled up in Aunt Kate's eyes, he hurried to end the conversation. He raised his hand to his chest. He gallantly clinked his glass of port, while all present were expectantly touching a glass, and said in a loud voice, "Let us drink to all three together. Let us drink to their health, wealth, long life, happiness, and prosperity, and may they long continue to maintain the proud and earned position they occupy in their profession, and the position of honor and affection they hold in our hearts." All the guests rose, glasses in hand, and turning to the three seated ladies sang in unison, with Mr. Brown as their leader, "For they are merry, merry fellows, for they are merry, merry fellows, for they are merry, merry fellows, which none can deny." Aunt Kate made free use of her handkerchief, and even Aunt Julia seemed moved. Freddie Malins kept time with his pudding fork, and the singers turned to each other as if in melodious conference, as they sang with emphasis. Unless he tells a lie. Unless he tells a lie. Then, turning once more to their hostesses, they sang. For they are jolly, jolly fellows, for they are jolly, jolly fellows, for they are jolly, jolly fellows, which no one can deny. The cheer that followed was carried beyond the dining room door by many other guests, and renewed again and again, with Freddie Malins acting as officer with his fork held high. The sharp morning air came into the hall where they were, so that Aunt Kate said, "Shut the door, somebody. Mrs. Malins will freeze to death." "Brown's out there, Aunt Kate," said Mary Jane. "Brown's everywhere," said Aunt Kate, lowering her voice. Mary Jane laughed at her tone. "Really?" she said archly. "He's very thoughtful." "He's been lying here like a madman," said Aunt Kate in the same tone, "all Christmas." She herself laughed good-naturedly this time, and then added quickly, "But tell him to come in, Mary Jane, and shut the door. I sincerely hope he didn't hear me." At that moment the hall door opened and Mr. Brown came in, laughing as if his heart would break. He was dressed in a long green overcoat with cuffs and collar of imitation astrakhan, and had an oval fur cap on his head. He pointed towards the snow-covered quay, from which came the sound of a long, high-pitched whistling. "Teddy's going to send all the taxis in Dublin away," he said. Gabriel came out of the little pantry behind the office, struggling to put on his overcoat, and looking round the hall said, "Hasn't Gretta come down yet?" "She's getting ready, Gabriel," said Aunt Kate. "Who's playing up there?" asked Gabriel. "Nobody. They're all gone." "Oh no, Aunt Kate," said Mary Jane. "Bartell Darcy and Mr. O'Callaghan's were not yet gone." "Someone's playing on the piano anyway," said Gabriel. Mary Jane looked at Gabriel and Mr. Brown and said with a shiver, "It makes me cold to look at you two gentlemen all bundled up like that. I shouldn't like to face the journey home at this hour." "There's nothing I'd like better at this moment," said Mr. Brown firmly, "than a nice walk in the country, or a brisk ride with a good thrashing between the axles." "We had a very good horse and trap at home," said Aunt Julia sadly. "The unforgettable Johnny," said Mary Jane, laughing. Aunt Kate and Gabriel laughed too. "Now what was so wonderful about Johnny?" asked Mr. Brown. "The late Patrick Morkan, our grandfather, that is," explained Gabriel. "Commonly known in his later years as the old gentleman, it was a cauldron of glue." "Ah, Gabriel," said Aunt Kate, laughing. "He had a starch factory." "Well, glue or starch," said Gabriel. "The old gentleman had a horse called Johnny, and Johnny used to work in the old gentleman's mill, going round and round, to turn the mill. All that was very nice, but now comes the tragic part about Johnny. One fine day the old gentleman thought he would like to take the gang to a military review in the park. May the Lord have mercy on his soul," said Aunt Kate sympathetically. "Amen," said Gabriel. So the old gentleman, as I say, saddled Johnny, and put on his best top hat and his best leather collar, and rode out in style from his ancestral mansion somewhere near Back Lane, I think. They all laughed, even Mrs. Malins in Gabriel's way, and Aunt Kate said, "Ah, Gabriel, he didn't really live in Back Lane. He only had the mill there." "Leaving the mansion of his ancestors," continued Gabriel, "he rode off with Johnny, and all went on very well until Johnny caught sight of the statue of King Billy, and whether he fell in love with the horse on which King Billy was riding, or whether he thought he was back at the mill, at any rate he began to walk round the statue. Gabriel was pacing round the hall in his galoshes amid the laughter of the others. He was pacing round and round, said Gabriel, and the old gentleman, who was a very pompous old gentleman, was extremely indignant. "Come on, sir." "What do you mean, sir? Johnny, Johnny. Extraordinary behavior. I can't understand the horse." The laughter which followed Gabriel's imitation of the incident was interrupted by a resounding knock at the hall door. Mary Jane ran to open it and let Freddie Malins in. Freddie Malins, with his hat well back and his shoulders hunched with cold, was panting and steaming after the exertion. "I could only get a taxi," he said. "Oh, we'll find another one along the quay," said Gabriel. "Yes," said Aunt Kate. "We'd better not leave Mrs. Malins standing in the draft." Mrs. Malins was helped down the front steps by her son and Mr. Brown, and after much maneuvering hoisted into the cab. Freddie Malins climbed in behind her and spent a long time getting her into the seat, with Mr. Brown helping him with advice. Finally, she was comfortably settled, and Freddie, Mellons invited Mr. Brown into the cab. There was much confused conversation, and then Mr. Brown got into the cab. The driver arranged the blanket over his knees and bent down to give the address. The confusion increased, and the driver was given different directions by Freddie Mellons and Mr. Brown, each with his head out of the cab window. The difficulty was knowing where to drop Mr. Brown along the way, and Aunt Kate, Aunt Julia, and Mary Jane helped in the doorway discussion, with crossed directions, contradictions, and much laughter. As for Freddie Mellons, he was speechless with laughter. He kept putting his head in and out of the window at great risk to his hat and telling his mother how the discussion was progressing, until at last Mr. Brown shouted to the astonished cabman above the noise of everyone's laughter, "Do you know Trinity College?" "Yes, sir," said the driver. "Well, drive right on to the gates of Trinity College," said Mr. Brown, "and then we'll tell you where to go. Do you understand now?" "Yes, sir," said the driver. "Make like a bird for Trinity College." "Right, sir," said the driver. The horse was whipped, and the carriage rumbled down the quay amid a chorus of laughter and farewells. Gabriel had not gone to the door with the others. He was in a dark part of the passage, looking up the stairs. A woman was standing near the top of the first flight, also in the shadow. He could not see her face, but he could see the terracotta and salmon-pink panels of her skirt, which the shadow made appear black and white. It was his wife. He could have thrown his arms around her hips and held her still, for his arms trembled with the desire to seize her, and only the pressure of his nails against her palms checked the wild impulse of his body. The porter paused on the stairs to lower the dying candle. They also paused on the steps below him. In the silence, Gabriel could hear the melting wax dripping onto the tray and the beating of his own heart against his ribs. The porter led them down a corridor and opened a door. Then he set his unsteady candle on a dressing table and asked what time they would be called in the morning. 8, said Gabriel. The porter pointed to the electric tap and began to mutter an apology, but Gabriel interrupted him. "We don't want any light. We have enough light from the street. And I say," he added, pointing to the candle, "that you, like a good man, take away this beautiful object." The porter took up the candle again, but slowly, for he was surprised at such an original idea. Then he murmured good night and went out. Gabriel locked the door. The ghostly light of the street lamp projected a long beam of light that went from a window to the door. Gabriel threw his overcoat and hat on a sofa and crossed the room to the window. He looked out at the street to calm his emotion a little. Then he turned and leaned against a chest of drawers, his back to the light. She had taken off her hat and cloak and was standing in front of a large rotating mirror, unbuttoning her waist. Gabriel stood for a moment watching her and then said, "Gretta." She slowly moved away from the mirror and walked along the beam of light towards him. Her face looked so serious and tired that the words did not come out of Gabriel's lips. No, it was not yet time. "You look tired," he said. "I am a little," she replied. "Don't you feel sick or weak?" "No, tired. That's all." She went to the window and stood there looking out. Gabriel waited again, and then, fearing that shyness was about to get the better of him, he said abruptly, "By the way, Gretta, what is it?" "Do you know that poor fellow Mellons?" he said quickly. "Yes." "And him? Well, poor fellow, he's a decent fellow after all," Gabriel went on in a false voice. "He gave me back that sovereign I lent him, and I didn't expect it, really. It's a pity he didn't keep away from that Brown, because he's not a bad fellow, really." He was trembling now with annoyance. Why did she seem so absent-minded? He didn't know how to begin. Was she also annoyed about something? If only she would turn to him or come to him of her own accord. To accept her as she was would be brutal. No, he must see some heat in her eyes first. He longed to master her strange mood. "When did you lend him the £1?" she asked after a pause. Gabriel struggled to restrain himself from uttering brutal language about the drunkard Mellons and his kennel. He longed to scream at her from the depths of his soul, to crush her body against his, to dominate her. But he said, "Oh, at Christmas, when he opened that little Christmas card shop in Henry Street. He was so overcome with rage and desire that he did not hear her come from the window. She stood before him for a moment, looking at him strangely. Then suddenly, rising on tiptoe and resting her hands lightly on his shoulders, she kissed him. "You are a very generous person, Gabriel," she said. Gabriel, trembling with pleasure at the sudden kiss and the singularity of the phrase, put his hands in her hair and began to smooth it back, barely touching it with his fingers. The washing had made it fine and shiny. His heart was overflowing with happiness. Just when he wanted her, she had come to him of her own accord. Perhaps her thoughts were in tune with his. Perhaps she had sensed the impetuous desire in him, and then the readiness to yield had overcome her. Now that she had fallen for him so easily, he wondered why he had been so shy. He stood up, holding her head in his hands. Then, quickly putting an arm around her body and drawing her to him, he said softly, "Gretta, my dear, what are you thinking about?" She did not answer, nor did she surrender herself completely to his arms. He repeated softly, "Tell me what it is, Gretta. I think I know what is happening." "Do I know?" She did not answer at once. Then, in a fit of tears, she said, "Oh, I'm thinking of that song, The Lass of Aughrim." She shook him off and ran to the bed and, throwing her arms over the railing, hid her face. Gabriel stood for a moment, astonished, and then followed her. As he passed the mirror, he saw himself full length in the loose, well-filled shirt, the face whose expression always puzzled him when he saw it in the mirror, and his shiny, gold-rimmed spectacles. He stopped a few feet away from her and said, "And the song? Why does it make you cry?" She raised her head from her arms and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand like a child. Her voice took on a gentler tone than he had intended. "Why, Gretta?" he asked. "I am thinking of a person who used to sing that song long ago." "And who was that person long ago?" asked Gabriel, smiling. "It was a person I knew in Galway when I lived with my grandmother," she said. The smile disappeared from Gabriel's face. A dull anger began to build up again in the back of her mind, and the dull flames of her lust began to burn furiously in her veins. "Someone you were in love with?" he asked sardonically. "It was a boy I knew," she answered, "named Michael Furey. He used to sing that song, The Lass of Aughrim. He was very delicate." Gabriel was silent. He did not want her to think that he was interested in this delicate boy. "I can see him so clearly," she said after a moment. "What eyes he had. Big, dark eyes. And what an expression in them. What an expression." "So you were in love with him?" said Gabriel. "I used to go walking with him," she said, "when I was in Galway." A thought flashed through Gabriel's mind. "Maybe that's why you wanted to go to Galway with that Ivors girl," he said coldly. She looked at him and asked, in surprise, what for? Her look made Gabriel feel uncomfortable. He shrugged and said, "How do I know?" "To see him, perhaps." She looked away from him, following the beam of light towards the window in silence. "He's dead," she said at last. "He died when he was only 17. Isn't it terrible to die so young?" "What was he?" Gabriel asked, still ironic. "He was in the gasworks," she said. Gabriel felt humiliated by the failure of her irony, and by the evocation of that figure from the dead, a boy from the gasworks. While he was filled with memories of their secret life together, full of tenderness and joy and desire, she was mentally comparing him to another. A shameful consciousness of his own person assailed him. He saw himself as a ridiculous figure, acting like a beggar to his aunts, a nervous, well-meaning sentimentalist, harangued by vulgarians and idealizing his own buffoonish desires, the pathetic, vain fellow he had glimpsed in the mirror. Instinctively, he turned more toward the light so that she would not see the shame burning on his brow. He tried to keep his tone of inquiry cool, but his voice when he spoke was humble and indifferent. "I suppose you were in love with this Michael, Furey, Gretta," he said. "I was very good with him then," she said. Her voice was veiled and sad. Gabriel, feeling now how futile it would be to try to lead her where he wanted, stroked one of her hands and said, also sadly, "And what did he die of so young, Gretta? Consumption, was it?" "I think he died for me," she answered. A vague terror seized Gabriel at this answer, as if, at that moment when he was hoping to triumph, some impalpable and vengeful being were approaching him, gathering forces against him in his vague world. But he shook it off with an effort of reasoning and continued to caress her hand. He did not question her further, for he felt that she would tell him about herself. Her hand was warm and moist. It did not respond to his touch, but he continued to caress it, just as he had caressed the first letter she had written to him that spring morning. "It was in the winter," she said. "About the beginning of the winter, when I was going to leave my grandmother's and come here to the convent, and he was ill at the time in his lodgings in Galway and would not be let out, and they sent word to his people at Oughterard. He was on the decline, they said, or something. I never quite knew." She paused for a moment and sighed. "Poor fellow," she said. "He was very fond of me and such a kind boy. We used to go out together and walk, you know, Gabriel, as one does in the country. He went to study singing just for his health's sake. He had a very good voice, poor Michael, Furey." "Well, and then?" asked Gabriel. "And then when it came time for me to leave Galway and go to the convent, he was much worse, and I did not want to see him. So I wrote a letter saying I was going to Dublin and would come back in the summer, and hoping he would get better." She paused for a moment to control her voice and then went on. "The night before I left, I was at my grandmother's house on Nuns Island packing, and I heard gravel being thrown against the window. The window was so wet I couldn't see, so I ran downstairs and out the back into the garden, and there the poor fellow was at the bottom of the garden shivering." "And didn't you tell him to come back?" asked Gabriel. "I begged him to come home at once and told him he would die in the rain, but he said he didn't want to live." "I can see his eyes too. He was standing at the end of the wall where there was a tree." "And did he go home?" asked Gabriel. "Yes, he did go home. And when I had only been in the nunnery a week, he died, and was buried at Oughterard where his people came from. Oh, the day I heard that he was dead." She stopped, choking with sobs, and, overcome with emotion, threw herself face down on the bed, sobbing into the blanket. Gabriel held her hand for a moment longer uncertainly, and then, afraid of interfering with her grief, he let it fall gently and walked silently to the window. She was fast asleep. Gabriel, leaning on his elbow, looked for a few moments without resentment at her tangled hair and her half-open mouth, listening to her deep breathing. So she had had that romance in her life. A man had died for her. It did not pain him now to think of the miserable part he, her husband, had played in her life. He watched her while she slept, as if they had never lived together as man and wife. His curious eyes rested long on her face and her hair, and as he thought of what she must have been then, in that time of her first youthful beauty, a strange and friendly compassion for her stole over his soul. He did not like to say even to himself that her face was no longer beautiful, but he knew that it was no longer the face for which Michael Furey had met his death. Perhaps she had not told him the whole story. His eyes moved to the chair on which she had thrown some of her clothes. A petticoat string hung down to the floor. One boot was standing upright, the soft shaft drooping. The other was lying on its side. He wondered at his whirlwind of emotions of an hour before. Where had they come from? From his aunt's dinner, from his own foolish words, from the wine and the dancing, from the joy of saying good night in the drawing room, from the pleasure of walking along the river in the snow. Poor Aunt Julia. She too would soon be a shadow, with the shadow of Patrick Morkan and his horse. He had caught that haggard look on her face for a moment when she had sung, "Arrayed for the Bridal." Soon, perhaps, he would be sitting in that very drawing room, dressed in black with his silk bonnet on his knees. The shutters would be drawn, and Aunt Kate would be sitting beside him, weeping and blowing her nose, and telling him how Julia had died. He searched his mind for some words that might comfort her, and found only feeble and useless words. Yes, it would happen very soon. The air in the room chilled his shoulders. He stretched cautiously under the covers and lay down beside his wife. One by one, they all turned into shadows. Better to pass courageously into that other world, in the full glory of some passion, than to fade and wither sadly with age, He thought of how the one who lay beside him had kept in her heart for so many years that image of her beloved's eyes when he had told her he did not want to live. Tears welled in Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt this way for any woman, but he knew that it must be love. The tears gathered in his eyes, and in the partial darkness he fancied he saw the figure of a young man standing beneath a dripping tree. Other figures were near. His soul had come near to that region where the vast hosts of the dead dwelt. He was aware, but could not grasp, of his own unstable and trembling existence. His own identity was fading away into a gray and impalpable world. The very solid world which those dead had once created, and in which they had lived, was dissolving and dwindling. A light tap on the glass made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily as the flakes, silvery and dark, fell slantwise against the lamplight. It was time to set out for the west. Yes, the newspapers had been right. Snow was widespread all over Ireland. It fell on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the marsh of Allen, and farther westward falling softly upon the dark, unruly waves of Shannon. It fell also on every part of the lonely graveyard on the hill where Michael Furey lay buried. It lay thickly heaped upon the crooked crosses and headstones, upon the spears of the little gate, upon the barren thorns. His soul fainted slowly, as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and falling faintly, like the descent of his last end, upon all the living and the dead. We have reached the end of this audiobook. The Virtual Books publishing team thanks for your visit. If you liked our channel, please subscribe and share. Thank you.